If you have been on the internet for a while, then you likely have seen an argument against religion and God made by Ricky Gervais.
See, if we take something like any fiction, in any holy book, in any other fiction, and destroyed it, okay, in 1,000 years' time, that wouldn't come back just as it was. Whereas if we took every science book, right, and every fact, and destroyed them all, in 1,000 years, they'd all be back, because all the same tests would be the same result.
That's good.
So essentially, his argument is that destroying all these books, religious and science, only science books would come back exactly the same, because science is based on observable, testable facts, which would be rediscovered in time. But religious books are purely cultural and subjective, so they would not return in the same form. The first issue is that he's fallen into a fallacy. This is known as the fallacy of begging the question, or circular reasoning. He assumes the very thing he is trying to prove, that religious books are purely human creations. This assumption presupposes that God does not exist, and therefore that these texts are not divinely revealed. But this is precisely the point under debate. By dismissing the possibility of divine revelation outright, his argument is flawed, because it only works if you agree with his atheistic premise. Now, even though he says 1,000 years, the fallacy still remains. It does not matter if he said 1,000, 1, 10 or 1,000,000, because it does not change the underlying assumption in his argument. He already presupposes that religious texts are entirely human inventions. It dismisses the possibility of divine revelation. The assumption remains circular, as it relies on the conclusion he's trying to prove, that religion is man-made and not divinely revealed. If we went along with his idea and his timeline, so today all religious books are gone. Nothing online for it, no applications on your phone or websites, etc. The only thing that's there is what people have in their hearts, what people have memorized. Religious texts can still be reproduced. Even with a hypothetical span of 1,000 years, the Quran and the Hadith would still be reproduced accurately. Muslims have preserved it through oral tradition. This is how the Quran was meant to be preserved. This is how it was preserved during the time of the Prophet and his companions, and then the generations that came afterwards to what we have today. It doesn't rely on written or digital mediums alone. It's deeply embedded in the collective memory of the Muslim community all over the globe. Even when it comes to the Hadith, I'm not a hafiz of the Quran. I don't know the whole Quran off by heart. Even I know some Hadith though. And people have memorized the Hadith corpuses. Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim. There are people who have memorized these entire books. So his assumption also ignores the evidence of preservation in the memories in the hearts of the people. And I believe this only exists with Islam as opposed to other religions. But even if you want to ignore the idea of preservation and memorization, let's say everybody's completely forgotten it, he still falls into the begging the question fallacy, because he's assumed from the offset that God does not exist. But if God does exist, then let's say Islam is true, then the Quran will still come back. The guidance would be revealed again. And his argument fails to consider this possibility, relying instead on the assumption that religion is entirely human-made. By excluding divine intervention as a premise, he is circularly proving his atheistic worldview rather than addressing the actual claim of religious belief, which includes the concept of divine preservation and revelation. That last part there is only applicable to Islam, as is well known among scholarship that the Bible and other religious scriptures have suffered corruption, whereas in Islam, majority of scholars agree that the Quran is preserved. Now, when it comes to Islam and proving Islam, I do not believe in using the argument of preservation and memorization in and of itself. I believe it's a proof of Islam, but you use it in conjunction with other arguments. For example, if you are calling someone to Islam, you could perhaps say to them that, do you think for a religion to be true, then at the very least, the religious text needs to be preserved to a very, very good degree minimum. And that what the early people believed, you should know what they believed. The text that's come to us today, there should be a transmission for it. It should be clear. And it should be like, we can trace this back. And if they say yes, which I think is a logical thing to say, if that question is posed, that hypothetical is posed, then how many religions do you rule out? Because another argument that atheists make against religion is that there are so many religions out there, why is your one true? And that is another one of Ricky's arguments against religion. And perhaps in another video I might tackle that, inshallah. But in summary, in response to this argument over here that he's made, he has fallen into a fallacy that presupposes the conclusion he is trying to prove, and his argument fails on that alone. But even if we were to look at another perspective of this, he ignores the idea of preservation through memorization, oral transmission. And in this case, I believe the only religion which comes out on top above every other religion is Islam. So I believe even in 1,000 years' time, using his timeline, the Quran would still be as we have it today, in a different modes of recitation, simply through people orally transmitting it down generation after generation after generation. Even if it was never written down again, never online, we would still have the Quran as we have it today. And I also believe we would have the Hadith too.